cool. Let's take a look at some of these presenter notes. Hi, everyone. My name is Jose Diaz Gonzalez. It's pronounced as if there are accents, but there aren't any in the actual name. And I'm an on-again, off-again CakePHP core developer. I'm also the CEO of HtmxHelper, if you couldn't tell by my shirt. You can also be one too. They sell the shirts online. So welcome to my talk. This is HtmxHelper, the revival of JsHelper. We're going to do a bit of excavation here, historically. Learn about the rich history of a very small portion of CakePHP, and hopefully introduce you guys to some exciting technology on the way there to use within your applications. Folks that have been using CakePHP since the dawn of time are probably going to be bored to tears. A lot of this will be just kind of the same old stuff that you've been learning this entire time. Anyone who's familiar with HtMx, which is what I'm going to introduce here, also probably will be bored as well. I'm very sorry. I apologize in advance if I'm crying. They're not tears of joy or sorrow. That's just my body dying. No, seriously, I might cry. I've previously given a ton of talks with pictures I gathered from the internet. This one will have very few pictures. I'm sorry. Anyone who's seen the last couple of my talks has also noticed that I drew a lot of the slides. I have no drawings here. There was a change in the budget. I had to lay off the animator. That's myself. So this talk will have no drawings. Sorry. I will have a bit of code that I will display here. Anything that I show code-wise, you can probably just pop into your terminal or into your code editor of choice. If that's Emacs, it's great. If it's Vim, not so great. It should work just fine, and it'll work. Finally, there's a couple disclaimers that I have for this talk. This talk is actually mostly just about the history of using Ajax and JavaScript within CakePHP and how we've traditionally displayed it to users, and then as well as how to use HtMx with CakePHP. None of this talk is anything official within CakePHP. We're not going to release any code for anything. There's not going to be a core edition that says, here's how you use HtMx directly with Cake. You don't need one. And there's no actual code for an HtmxHelper. That was just kind of something that I wanted people to assume was going to come. But later you'll see why we don't actually need any code for any of that. So first off, let's have a raffle. This is raffle time. What is raffle time? When I initially envisioned this talk, it was about 15 to 30 minutes of how do you integrate HtMx with your CakePHP application. I was tricked into a much longer talk, and now I have to fill 60 minutes. I don't think that I have 60 minutes worth of content, and so I was like, what am I going to do? As I was writing the talk, I realized that, again, I needed a bit of filler. And unfortunately, rather than just talk about something that's unrelated to CakePHP, or fortunately, I guess, I decided to have a raffle where I'll take a bit of time to display what it is that we're going to do. This is a bit shameless of me. I'm very sorry. Most people will just actually give talks on what it is that they said they were going to present. But the raffle prizes are real. So anyone who wins something, you're probably going to be happy. If you don't win something, maybe you got tricked into watching this talk. But anyways, all the winners, those are the people who really matter. So, unfortunately, raffle time is only for the people who are attending CakeFest in person. If you want to win something and you're remote, you can win something from the lovely CakeDC people who are throwing off CakeFest. For those following at home, maybe next year, if I get tricked again into giving a talk, I will have something online for you, but for now, it's all in person. So I'm going to give a demo of what it is that I'm going to give away. So let's start with that. Let's see now. Raffle. Great. So I'll put some numbers in here. The raffle number here corresponds with whatever number you were given. So if you get picked, that's great. You win a prize. The first prize is a CakePHP elephant. That's this one, the red one. So let's select that winner. I'm going to poll every 2 seconds. Hopefully this works. There's no winner yet. Sorry. Oh, can I not present? The winner is 2. Who's 2?
That's me.
Well, I guess you won. Here you go.
I mean, Mark.
Throw it.
And I'm the other one.
Yeah.
Great. Awesome.
You can move the window like it's a second.
Can I?
Yeah, you can just, there you go.
I swear that was completely random. I just clicked the button. There's no winner. There's no winner. There's no winner. Come on, is there a winner? Give that to number 11. Who was number 11? You won too many already.
I agree.
Anyways, we'll go back to my talk. The next winner cannot be a core developer. I'm sorry. So before we continue my talk, actually, I'm going to go back to a demo. The demo is pre-made. All of the code I've already completed. I'm going to show off how the code works. The demo is pre-made because I think live coding is pretty dangerous. I'm going to mess it up, and I don't really want to mess it up. I'm very tired right now. And I don't want to display anything like terrible like my bank account or something in the command line, and then people like take all of my money and I'm stranding in Luxembourg. So first off, we're going to start with bake. We're going to bake our migration. If you run that code, that'll actually create a migration in your application. You can create a new CakePHP application, Composer, I think, init or something like that, create project. But you create your migration. I am specifying that every article is going to have a title. It's going to have some content, and it's going to be a photo URL. When you bake a migration, you can actually specify fields and their types, as well as indexes if you wanted to. And so I'm taking advantage of that. I'm also going to run those migrations, migrations migrate. I'll create a seed. So if you're not familiar with seed classes, they contain information that you can start your application with, whether that's for demo purposes or because you're bootstrapping an environment online. And then finally, my seed will acquire faker. I'm going to just insert a bunch of fake records, and so I'm just going to Composer require that. Seed class is pretty straightforward. We're using faker here to, well, I'm sorry about the formatting. We're using faker here to generate 100 fake records, fake titles, content, and a placeholder URL. If this was a real application, I would probably have some place where I'm storing the photos. That title would not be in Latin, etc. But here we are. Now we're going to run that seed data. We're going to bake our models or table classes. I'm also going to bake a controller with an index action called articles. And then I'm going to create a placeholder articles template, index.php. It's pretty straightforward. On the template side, this is pretty much all that we need to show. It's pretty simple. We iterate over every single article, kind of display it in a generic way. We display the title, the content for the or the image, and that's about it. And then there's a little bit of pagination code. We check to see if there's a next page, and then like print out the page link. The pagination code is actually all of the magic that we need in this application. There's nothing really fancy here otherwise. So what happens here is when we show that last article and there is a next page, we'll display a special span. That span has the link. And when that span is shown on the page, when it's revealed, if you see the HX trigger, it will trigger the HX get. It'll get that request out, right? So HtMx is basically powered by HTML attributes. HX get, it'll create a get request for the URL that we specified. The response of the HX get is then going to be added to the end via HX swap of the HX target specified. So you can specify anything on your page, and that's where HtMx is going to interact with your application. In this particular case, it's going to be div with the ID of articles. And we're also selecting just the elements that have a class of .article from the response to append, right? So you can target and say, hey, like this is the only thing that I want from that response, and I want to place it here, and that's what we're doing, right? So hopefully pretty straightforward. We're also going to simplify our layout code. There's nothing really fancy here. I made some CSS that makes the application kind of look fine. I vendored HtMx minified. I don't rely on CDNs because, again, this is a demo. I don't know if I'm going to have internet here, so I didn't want to have anything that would potentially break. I also don't really like relying on CDNs I don't control. If you're deploying this in production, you probably want to put that on a CDN that you control. Again, not something like Cloudflare or anything, or maybe you're hosted via Cloudflare, but at least you have the control over the DNS. So yeah. Oh, also I want to say that I borrowed/stole that CSS file. So if you find an application out there online that is pretty similar to what I'm going to display to you in a bit, I'm very sorry, but I'm not really that sorry. So let's go to the demo. Hopefully the demo will show. So we're gonna go, here we go. Where am I? Beautiful. So we're gonna display this demo. So here's the demo, lovely demo application. So to show that it actually does work, I'm gonna refresh this page and hopefully it works. Cool. So we are displaying 10 records on the page. I'm gonna scroll down to the bottom of the record. Holy crap, can I not translate this thing? Cool. We're gonna scroll down to the bottom of the page and you will notice that only one record is shown right there. When I scroll to the end, it'll automatically fill in. So we have this infinite scroll application. It's pretty neat. Pretty straightforward. There wasn't really anything extra that we had to do. It was just all HTML records that or HTML attributes that we added to a single span, and that gave us infinite scroll on our application. Nothing fancy. So going back to my slides. So there's one minor optimization that we can create. When I generated that application, we actually are also, and I'll show you in a little bit, when HtmX makes the request to the page or to our server, it'll respond with the entire response of your application. So in this particular case, it's doing a GET request to articles that will show the layout and also the content within that layout, and then we're selecting responses from within that, or selecting elements from within that response. One minor optimization we can have is we can disable the layout from being rendered when we get an HtMX request. In a real application, you would 100% do this because the layout might contain a ton of extra logic that you don't actually want to run, and it would make your application responses very, very slow. To do this, we can check the HX request header, and in this particular case, I'm doing that by get header line from the request object. You can also add that code into your app controller initialize if you wanted to, if your application everywhere kind of supports HtMX. For this demo, have it just in the controller. Also, while writing this talk, I was actually thinking about writing an HtmxHelper, like really, that truly was gonna happen. And I was pretty excited. I was busy writing it, it was pretty great. But I realized it's not actually super useful to have the logic for what it is that I'm doing in the view layer. You notice that like a lot of the code here wasn't really extra code, there was just some attributes, and everyone here can add some extra attributes to their calls to like present some HTML. So there wasn't really anything extra. Thankfully, actually, there was someone, Juhani Aronin, I hope I did not mispronounce your name, from Home Run. He released a plugin earlier this week, actually on Monday, and that was actually quite a bit better than what I was envisioning, and it pushed everything into the controller layer. And so that's kind of where I feel HtMX is suited for any integration in CakePHP, and so that's what I'm using here. So I rewrote really a bunch of the application and this talk to kind of use reflect that new method. So first, if you want to use this plugin, you just CakePHP or Composer require the application or the plugin. So we then load it up into our application with bin cake plugin load. And then we load that component in the app controller initialize. So pretty straightforward, standard CakePHP stuff. There's nothing really anything complex here. I'm just including it for completeness. The other change that we're going to do to our application is rather than check for a header response, we're going to use a detector. The HtMX plugin includes a bunch of detectors that are pretty nifty for figuring out whether or not your application should be responding in a certain way for HtMX applications. And this one's pretty straightforward, just is an HtMX request. Again, the HtMX plugin includes a bunch of other detectors that you can use via the custom middleware that it loads via the component. So if you want to take a look at those are great. So again, rather than check for the header directly, we now just use that detector. So yeah. The other thing that the plugin kind of proposes is using view blocks for managing what we display for various responses. I think this is pretty neat. If you're familiar with Rails and their turbo frames implementation, they will kind of just like have all your HTML in that Ruby template and specify, hey, like this is the thing that I want to generate. This is kind of the same thing for the CakePHP template layer. You can just kind of use view blocks. I'll show that. I think it's pretty neat, and I'll show an alternative in a second. This will kind of allow you to reuse that content within your application without really needing to make too many major changes. So we'll start by specifying the view block to show. It's articles, pretty neat. The articles block here also actually corresponds with that HX target, if you remember from my template before, that I specified. So we can actually just say, hey, get the target and display whatever that is. So if your template has multiple HtmX targets or like sections of code that you want to display, you can say, this is the one that I want to use for this particular thing, and just kind of like automatically retrieve that. This doesn't always work, and I'll show you why in a later demo, but for this demo purpose, it's kind of pretty good. All right, cool. Finally, if we go back to our template, we're going to make very, very minor changes to our application. Basically just wrap the for loop that we had where we were displaying all of the articles with the view block. So start the view block, end the view block, and then we're going to render that view block afterwards. It's pretty straightforward. I'm going to go back to that demo. This demo is actually a little bit different. Hopefully I remember what the URL is for that. Let's see. Here we go. Let's see. Give me a moment. I don't remember what that URL was. Cool. Articles, controller. Cool, HTML index. Great. So, I think it's index. Maybe that works. No. I promise you this works. Change that URL to index. Index 2. Cool. I'm just going to alias it because I'm pretty bored. So this is that same template, or that same demo. It's just kind of slightly a different URL. I'm going to display what the network calls are here. So we're going to refresh that page. It's still in Latin, unfortunately. So if you're familiar with Latin, you can translate it at your will. So we're going to scroll down. And at this point, we're going to display extra stuff. So you'll see here, we get a HTML request in our browser. The response here is just that that template that we wanted. If we look at the headers is pretty nifty too. We're going to retrieve that article's URL. We're going to make an HX request, it's true, and the target that we specify is being passed along, right? So the target, again, is something that we specified in an attribute, and pretty straightforward. I'm going to show off the code for this, just to make sure that everyone believes that this actually works. So that was my original index 2. This is just our, like, I'm looking for the header line. I have another index article, and that's basically the same thing, except I used the HtMx plugin to detect the request, and then I'm setting a block here. It's pretty straightforward stuff. So we're going to go back to our demo, or our talk. There's an alternative to view blocks. I think view blocks are pretty heavyweight in many cases, especially if you just want to render a particular element in your page. So it'd be great if you just have that element. So I'm going to start by using that. I'm going to separate the guts of the thing that we want to render into a custom element. The element path is there. And that's just, again, going to be the content of that view block that we displayed. It's just going to be in an element now. The change to the actual template is going to be also pretty straightforward. Just render that element. Anyone who's familiar with CakePHP and the view layer, it's going to be basically the same stuff that you've always done. The other thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to change the template path to element. By default, the view path is aligned, or the template path is aligned to whatever your controller is. That's all automatic by CakePHP, but in our case, we want to render from somewhere else. So I'm going to change that to element. And then I'm going to set the actual template itself to the template that we want to render. In this particular case, that's just like element that contains the for each loop. This kind of allows us to bypass the entire original template. The nice thing about this is that on your first page render, everything's going to load up just fine. So that means for SEO purposes, you will display the application. Everything kind of just works. And then when you want to actually just display that particular content for the infinite scroll, you can kind of just do that, and then there's nothing extra that you need to worry about. If the nice thing about this is if your controller has a ton of extra logic, you can kind of just skip that and say, hey, is this an HtMX request? Is it for this particular target? Let me just display that. Or let me just run the logic that is needed or necessary for that. You can also specify a different action if you wanted to via the hxget attribute and just run the logic for your particular app and just assume that it's always going to be an HtMX request. I'm going to assume that that live demo is exactly the same because it actually is. There's nothing really fancy here. It just kind of works. So I'm going to skip that. So anyways, we're going to go to another raffle time. That was a great demo. Hopefully everyone learned everything. That's the end of my talk. This raffle is going to be for another CakePHP elephant. I previously had the privilege of borrowing Larry Master's backpack at a previous CakeFest, and I stole a bunch of these elephants, so now I need to give them away. This is the second one I'm going to rehome, so I'll give that away now. I'm going to go back to my demo. Let's take a look at that demo. Beautiful. We're going to go back to here. I'm going to select another winner. Again, if a Cake core developer or a CakeDC member wins, they're not actually going to win. So we're just going to keep selecting. So hopefully this works. It's going to pull 27. Wow, 27 is actually the number I have in my talk slide. So you win. Here's your prize. Thank you for showing up. You're not a Cake core developer, are you?
No.
Okay, great.
Yeah, not yet.
If you are, you have to give it back. Cool. So now we're going to get into my actual talk rather than just slides about a demo or raffles. The raffles and the demos are done. Let's go back in time a little bit. I'm unable to tell history objectively, so all of this is going to be about my experiences with CakePHP and software development in general. I'm very sorry if like that doesn't kind of jive with you. I'm going to embellish something. If I embellish something a bit or if something sounds wrong, feel free to correct me after the talk, preferably via an email that I can nervously ignore just like I used to when I was doing consulting work. So in 2005, I was still a teenager. I didn't really know what I was doing. I was building applications with Joomla, OpenRealty, WordPress. Some of you may remember some of these names. Hopefully you're not still using some of these technologies. If anyone here remembers Dynamic Drive, that's kind of where I went all the time to get my scripts. I can't be the only one trying to desperately remember or to ensure that some internet script out there or anything kind of like really worked. In like Internet Explorer 4 or 5, I was going out there saying, hey, like, how do I get my code to run across all of these browsers? I didn't even have that many computers that could run these browsers. They probably crashed all the time, etc. Right, so here's a picture, lovely picture of Dynamic Drive. It's pretty great. It's not changed too much in the past 20 years. There's a lovely image of someone exploding. Today they don't have any GIFs. That's pretty good. I think the internet, again, hasn't changed too much. We've just removed some of the animated GIFs, maybe changed a little bit of the color schemes. Hopefully I haven't changed too much either. So at the time, the most, again, I ever did was kind of dynamic HTML, if anyone is developing back then kind of remembers. I could write like maybe 15 lines of code to click on a DOM element and slide it up or slide it down to do what it is that I need to do, maybe expand out a menu, etc. I really, really did not understand what I was doing. And changing that to do any code that I wrote or found from Dynamic Drive or any similar site to do something slightly different was almost impossible for me. Maybe for you it was great, but like not for myself. JavaScript for me was something that Wizards and Witches wrote because you had to use magic in order to make some of this code work across all of the browsers. It just didn't there was no way to make it work across every single browser version, the operating systems that you had, maybe even devices in some cases. If anyone remembers, the largest screen you could have was 800 by 600. And that was pretty great. And then they came out with bigger monitors, and all of a sudden all of our websites didn't work. CSS was also in a similar state of terror. I'm not even going to get into that. We didn't have Stack Overflow for asking questions. You had to pay some amount of money in order to get past the paywalls on Experts Exchange, or it required knowing how to use Usenet in order to ask questions for these wizards, these witches, these warlocks. I certainly did not have a credit card, so I could not do this. I was, again, a teenager. Similarly, if you wanted live answers from a real human being, you had to spin up an IRC client, figure out what was the best server to ask your question, and figure out what channel that you had to ask it on, hop on, and hope someone who could answer your answer was actually awake, or they had their client online and they had infinite scroll back and could go see what their question was and would answer at some point that you could actually see, right? Very much impossible to get a response. Discord and Slack, I think, for better or worse, are a godsend in comparison. So that was 2004. 2005 had a few interesting developments. First was the rise of Ajax. If anyone remembers, the X in Ajax corresponds with XML, which is pretty great because no one was responding with XML for any of our responses, although we did have standards compliant HTML that we were trying to respond with. The rise of Ajax itself actually was kind of pushed forward by the early JavaScript libraries, not even frameworks at the time. Prototype, if you look up Prototype, that was kind of like the first one. And they actually called themselves a JavaScript framework, which they're very different from JavaScript frameworks today. But Prototype, like other frameworks similar to it, they kind of extended the DOM, made it simple for you to do kind of extra stuff to HTML elements. It made it easier to interact with HTML in your applications. So you no longer had to have a 15-line script. It could probably be 1 or 2 lines. Some people will probably notice a recurring theme in my talk, where I'm going to talk about kind of where the developments come from in the JavaScript community. Prototype was pushed forward by Sam Stephenson of Ruby fame. He was on the Ruby on Rails core team. He created it to kind of just have a simpler way for Rails developers to write JavaScript within their applications. Again, realizing that 15 lines of code is not really that friendly to someone who only knows Ruby, right? So it made it very simple for Rails developers, at least, to interact with, make interactive applications. It was pretty successful and spawned a couple different frameworks on top of it. This is a screenshot of the Scriptaculous homepage. If anyone remembers it, it was pretty great because you could just like fade in, fade out, have like different animations, and that was like pretty phenomenal back in 2005. Anyone who used Prototype was probably actually also using Scriptaculous on top, so you had 2 different libraries that you were using. Again, Prototype allowed you to have kind of like these simple interactions with JavaScript. Scriptaculous allowed you to have simple interactions with animations and effects that you can have in your applications. So stuff like drag and drop, Ajax requests, etc. All of that was baked into Scriptaculous, so you use both, right? Using both was actually like a pretty good way to make your applications pretty snazzy. Maybe pad your bank account with a couple extra zeros because people wanted to go to you because you knew how to make like cool websites. At the same time, maybe actually a bit later the next year, jQuery came out. jQuery, if anyone's familiar with it, hopefully you are at some point. You've used it. Came from John Resnick. He gave it at a talk. He pushed forward a talk in Boston and was like, hey, here's this thing that I made. It's pretty great. jQuery is pretty cool because it fixed a bunch of issues in Prototype. So for instance, you didn't have to monkey patch a DOM, which is great because then you could use kind of different versions of jQuery, which is another problem that you might have had in the past where they kind of all fight with each other. But you no longer like modified the browser DOM and just had this library that was completely separate. It's also a lot more performant, which honestly at the time like probably didn't matter for the applications I was building because I was just fading things in and out. I didn't really need the performance that jQuery was pushing forward. But it did also provide an abstracted API for how to interact with the browser. So if you remember from Prototype, again, it made it simple to interact with the browser, but you probably still needed to know exactly how IE5 on a Mac versus IE5 or IE4 on a Mac versus IE4 on Windows worked, right? In jQuery's case, it made it very simple to understand, like, hey, it's the same way across all browsers, across all operating systems, etc. So you didn't really need to learn anything specific about a particular browser. You can just use jQuery. Kind of just worked. MooTools was another framework that came out. I feel as though it also ran. I think a few people used it, but I didn't use it. Mark Story apparently used it. I don't, he's like lambasting me right now. This is not your talk, Mark. Like you already ruined my talk before. You were not going to do this again. Provided kind of the same features and functionality that you would get out of both Prototype and Scriptaculous at the same time. If you wanted to do animations, you would use MooFX on top of that. It's pretty cool. Again, I didn't use it very often, but one of the nice things that MooTools came out with was this like object-oriented programming thing that you could do in JavaScript, which if you use JavaScript in the past or in the present, it's kind of not object-oriented, kind of. And so it like kind of standardized a bunch of that stuff. And I think that like really influenced a lot of like the more modern frameworks and kind of like bringing some of that object-oriented programming that people are familiar with from like back-end development frameworks. The equivalent here for what they did was how CakePHP kind of treats drivers for various things. So if you're looking at the caching or queuing or data store access, right, it's kind of the same thing as abstracting how a browser works, right? You interact with that one API, and it works kind of everywhere. You can kind of switch from one driver to another. You can switch from one browser to another. You can switch from one operating system to another, and like the frameworks kind of made it all just work. It's pretty fancy, pretty neat. Again, you didn't have to at this point, you didn't have to load up 15 different browsers to test whether or not your application would fade in that div or not. It mostly just worked, mostly at least. Honestly, I think the promise of write once, load everywhere never really came to fruition. I think a lot of people today, if you're making a website that is customer facing or consumer facing, you probably still pay in some fashion for a website testing service that will load your application in 100 browsers or across 30 different devices. And that never really changed from 20 years ago. I think like the unfortunate thing is developers have been fighting the browser implementers for the past 20, 30 years, and I don't think that's going to change. The interactivity that you wanted to create in your applications, 20, 30 years ago, or even today, you still need to know how the DOM works in order to, across browsers, in order to make that kind of performant or work across your different devices. The abstractions could really only bring us so far, and developers again needed to know how things like selectors worked everywhere. Again, like you don't have well, maybe today you have probably the same selectors across most browsers, but there are certain things that are only implemented in, say, Chrome or only in Firefox. And as a developer, you still need to know some of those things. And while the jQuery and MooTools and those kind of libraries made those pretty similar everywhere, there were still kind of edge cases that you needed to be aware of, and that was true then, that's still true today. You also probably still needed to know stuff like how to center a div in your particular browser of choice, because that wasn't always the same. Cool. So we're getting back on topic. Everyone knows CakePHP is the best framework, and we really only implement the best code. So of course we saw that all of our users in 2004, 2005, 2006, they wanted to implement this like cool new JavaScript AJAX stuff in their application, and they want to create interactive AJAX applications that everyone could use. And so we built the JsHelper. When I say we, that wasn't me. I actually don't know who built it. We lost history twice over the past 20 years, or 20 years, yeah, it has been 20 years. We've lost history twice. So if you go back on GitHub, the last release that you'll see is 1.2.0, or the first release you'll see is 1.2.0. If you want to go to 1.1, which is the earliest I can see any mention of the JsHelper, there's no source for that. Maybe if someone has something online, they can prove me wrong. Mark's story's telling me no. I might have it on a hard drive somewhere at home, but I'm not going to dig that up. The JsHelper was pretty neat. You could use it to provide functionality like autocomplete, drag and drop. Developers probably would write a little bit of JavaScript and strings in PHP in their applications, and then push that off to the browser, and then pray that to your deity, to your $ deity, that it would probably just work, and the browser would load everything correctly. So here's like actually an example from the bakery where someone was like, this is kind of just works, right? For Scriptacular, it's pretty great. You have your embedded JavaScript in PHP, and it's pretty horrible, pretty terrible, but this is what we were working with. The JsHelper, again, itself was built against Scriptaculous, so we only had support for one particular framework at a time. And using it we use it to provide interactivity to applications. So users could, of course, implement, supplement that with their custom JavaScript. In this particular case, this example is doing exactly that. And again, the first decade of, kind of these interactive applications was a much simpler time. So that's really all you needed to do, right? Applications today are much more demanding, don't have, and don't necessarily have just like a raw string of JavaScript in your PHP, etc. One thing that was interesting here is that you kind of still needed to deal with cross-browser issues. Again, the libraries at the time made some of this kind of work everywhere, but not really. And the other thing here is that most of the community was moving away from prototype and Scriptaculous and moving towards jQuery, right? So if you're familiar with software development in the front end field for the past 20 years, jQuery has probably been top of mind. So slightly before I joined the core team, they released Cake 1.3. For front-end development, CakePHP, the CakePHP 1.3 release was pretty interesting in that it finally provided an abstraction on top of the various JavaScript libraries that you could use for common tasks, right? They changed from having just the JsHelper, and you could still use JsHelper in a Cake 1.3 app, to using the JsHelper. And then you could drop Scriptaculous in favor of jQuery if that's what it was that you were using in your application anyways. I personally like this. I had written a very small amount of JavaScript at the time, but it was mostly just very terrible jQuery. But I could finally just drop that and use the JsHelper in my applications directly. I could finally kind of understand all of the JavaScript that was going on in my application, and I didn't need to know 2 different frameworks or 2 different libraries for interacting with JavaScript in our applications. I'd also like to take a moment to state that there was nothing actually blocking me from using jQuery before. I could use Prototype and I could use jQuery at the same time in my app. You could fight with them, you could namespace jQuery, and it kind of just worked. I also want to say that I mostly stayed away from the JsHelper. I didn't really use it that much because it helped bootstrap a lot of the front-end stuff that you could do, but there was always an edge case that it didn't really quite cover, and then I needed to kind of drop down directly into JavaScript in order to build my application. So for instance, if drag and drop worked out of the box, that was pretty great. But we didn't render, if we didn't actually render the list in place, we would maybe click on a button and then render it. So you needed to have some extra JavaScript interaction to do that, right? The drag and drop also needed to wait maybe in certain applications for a timer to hit, or maybe until the rest of the page was ready, or like some other random requirement that the client had. Maybe there was a clown that had to bounce before you could use drag and drop on your page. And so the JsHelper was great in that it provided that simple interactivity, but it didn't provide that last mile of whatever it is that we need to implement. Actually, here's a bakery post where someone was like, hey, it doesn't actually cover this particular requirement, right? So there were people still kind of just hacking around the JsHelper to make it kind of work, right? So while I'd rarely use the helper, or I would implement something simple with it, I would inevitably take it out of my application once the application got even slightly more complex. And I think that's also how most of the community felt about the JsHelper. It worked until it didn't, and that was kind of almost all the time, right? So I'm going to give another demo. So it's been a little while since I gave my last demo. This demo is also using HtMx. We're going to build a very small application. Again, one thing I want to stress in all of these demos is that HtMx is kind of a progressive technology. You don't really need to know too much extra on top of all of the stuff that you already know about CakePHP, about the view layer, about HTML in general, in order to use HtMx. You just build little small pieces on top of your application in order to enhance the experience for your users. So in this particular case, we're going to build search. It's a pretty common thing to have in your application. You render a table, or you have some page that has some results, and you want people to be able to interact with that and search for responses, right? Typically, you're searching a database. Maybe you're searching a flat file. I don't know. You're filtering those results, displaying the relevant results to your users. It's pretty great. In this particular case, we're going to start by updating the sample index page that we have. In this example, I've renamed it to search. Again, you can name it whatever you want. You could even reuse that index action that you had. So yeah. The index page just paginates by default. So we want to have some form of search. I could create a custom finder for the demo. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to mutate the query in place. But again, you can do whatever it is that you really need to. My search is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to make a like query against my database. Again, you can search another database if you wanted to. It's just for demo purposes. One thing that you'll also notice is that I'm setting the layout to the old default. In my previous demo, I customized the layout. In this demo, I'm going to use the default CakePHP layout. I just renamed them. It's purely cosmetic. Doesn't really change anything to the application. The only extra change I've done to the layout is included the HtMx library minified in the header. Finally, I'm also going to use detector to check if it's an HtMx request, and then use an element for the template. A difference here from our previous method is that I'm respecting a header for that element. HtMx, and I'll show you how this works in a bit. HtMx allows you to inject extra headers to the request, or even just mutate the request in general if you need to. And I'm abusing that to show how, or to display how we can use that to show a different element. You don't need to do that. You can hard code it if you want to. You can also add other headers if you want. So this is just an example. Again, one possible improvement that we can have is to move the disabling of the layout and setting of the template path in the app controller initialize. You would only do that if you want to do that everywhere in your application. I'm just displaying it here because it's a demo. I'm going to skip a bunch of work, but I'll be baking that search action template using and then customizing it. For the demo, I'm going to use the articles index template that we have in Bake, and I'm just going to put that the search template. You can also use an pre-existing template that you have in your application if you're modifying a pre-existing app. Feel free to do that. I'm gonna show. Oh, sorry. If you look at the template, the only thing that I'm going to add is a form control, and that's going to go on the top of the page. In the previous demo, we would have a trigger that occurred whenever you revealed that span on the page, meaning whenever we scrolled into that span, you would show it. In this case, we only want to trigger we only want to have the HtMx trigger when there's a key up, when we change the input, and we want to have a delay of 500 milliseconds. So that way people can type a bunch of stuff, and we won't constantly make HTML requests. This will make the application a little bit more responsive, and there won't be so much jank occurring and too many extra requests in your application. The other thing here, again, is that I have a little bit of extra code for specifying the HxHeaders property. This takes a JSON object, so in my particular case, I am JSON encoding a dictionary or an array in PHP. You can also specify a bit of JavaScript code that will dynamically generate your headers. All of my demos here don't require JavaScript code. I don't think that it's necessary for most applications that we're building, and so I'm not going to show how that works, but you can do that if you want to. You can also kind of abuse this to do other things in your app. In this particular case, I'm abusing it to specify an element that we want to display. You could say that it's a particular action that happens in your application, and then use that in your app to specify here's the particular element you want to display based on some other thing. You could also, instead of doing it with this like extra header, you can just specify a different action completely that has your logic. It's kind of up to you. It doesn't really matter. We're also going to update the URL bar to use it via the hx replace URL trigger. That needs to be a string of true, not a string of Boolean true, or not a Boolean true. If you specify a Boolean true, it's going to update your URL to have a 1 there for casting, so just keep that in mind. But in this particular case, we're changing the URL, and that's going to change the existing browser entry, the browser history entry. You can update the URL, or you can push a new URL via hx push URL if you wanted to. So if every single query needs to be a new entry in your history state, you can do that as well. HtMx kind of allows you to do either. You don't have to do it at all if you don't want to. It's kind of up to you. HtMx comes with a number of core attributes that control how the interactions will work. So instead of doing a GET request that we're showing here, we can use a post, we can do a put, or we can do a delete via hx put, post, hx put, or hx delete. The entire request could be modified via the hx request attribute. We can also create confirmation modals or even disable HtMx completely for things that come back from the response. It's kind of up to you. But with very few exceptions, all of this is controlled by just generic HTML attributes on your elements. And there's no JavaScript required. And that's really what I want to impress upon people. You don't need to have JavaScript in your application. You can avoid it completely other than that initial include of the library. Mark Story showed off some of this in his talk where you can have a little bit of JavaScript that injects headers into all of your requests, for instance. But it's completely possible just to avoid it completely for your application, whether that's in CakePHP app or any other application. And again, this demo really only uses HTML attributes to make the dynamic HTML possible. So if you built a CakePHP application before, you can build one with HtMx just fine and not really have to learn a new language for it. So similar to our previous version, I'm going to store the element code. I'm going to use that element to store the actual code that I want to render for the HtMx request. Again, we could have used a view block or avoided this together, or avoided all of this by using hxSelect in order to retrieve just the particular elements I want from that response and display that. It's kind of up to you. What method you utilize really depends on what it is that you need to do within your application. But I really, really do recommend on sticking to one method within your app, just so that you can go across your application and kind of understand what's going on. So I'm gonna go back to this live demo. So this live demo is search. Let's hope that that works just fine. So we're gonna go to our demo page. That's not it. Actually, this is where I found this HtMx plugin. It's pretty great. I am going to use this for my talk on Friday. And I did. So here we have our sample articles index page. If you're familiar with Bake, I didn't really do anything fancy here. I added an input field to search for the responses. You can see down here there's going to be some HTML requests. So that's pretty neat. You'll notice that I only made one request because there was a delay. It replaced everything in that element that we wanted, and I still have everything else. Unfortunately, the pagination is a little weird because I didn't replace that, but you can do that if you wanted to. You could even replace multiple things at once instead of having to hack a helper in the CakePHP. Pretty nifty, right? So pretty straightforward. Let's go back to my talk. It's nothing super fancy. I didn't have to do any JavaScript here, and this is like your typical Cake application otherwise, right? And a regular CakePHP application, you'd have to enter in some input, and then you press enter. You have a full page reload, and you respond with the entire HTML response that you'd need. So that means that you would render the rest of the view, you'd render the rest of the element, you'd have a ton of extra logic that might not need to be necessary in your application. So cool. We're gonna do one last raffle. I think we're doing good on time, are we? Great, awesome. And if not, I can only apologize via email, so please send those emails. I will ignore them. For our we gave the second prize away, so this is gonna be a different prize. This is gonna be a book. So if you're familiar with HtMx, they have a lovely hardcover book here. I think it's appropriate to give away an HtMx book. Maybe I'll give something else at the next CakeFest, or if you're at the bar, you can convince me to give away something different, like another elephant, but we'll see. So I'm gonna go back to my demo, my raffle demo. Beautiful raffle demo. So I'm gonna pick another winner. Again, core developers and CakeDC employees cannot win. So if we're actually gonna select demo winner 30? Is that someone here? 30? No? Okay, we're gonna try again. I'm sorry if you went home, you're just not gonna win. No winner yet, keep waiting. Lucky number 13. Unlucky number 13, cool. Keep doing that. 31, is that a number? Bingo, anyone? No? Jesus, where is everyone? There's no winner yet, I'm sorry. If this person isn't here, we're gonna skip. 31.
Try again.
Are you 31?
No, but I can volunteer.
Okay, well, you're not gonna win. So no one won the HtMx book, but don't worry, that's fine. You're gonna have another opportunity to win the HtMx book. So again, honestly, the JsHelper was a source of a lot of frustration for developers and for the core maintainers. Lots of folks were confused on how to use it, and when they were using it, they either forgot to include a library for whatever it is that they were trying to include, or they forgot to set some option to make the Ajax work with the DOM elements in question on their page. And it wasn't really that interesting for core developers to like contribute to. Like, it's just not something that's fun for us to do, and therefore we just didn't want to do anything with it. We'd previously removed the JsHelper in the Cake 2.0 release that came out in 2011. And then slightly more than a year later, we included, and that was slightly more than a year after including the JsHelper in 1.3. So sometime in the 2.0 release cycle, I remember there were discussions on removing the JsHelper. It was pretty contentious. Most people were on the side of remove it. I was on the side of keep it, and I don't know why that was the case, because I didn't use it, but here we are. We decided to remove it in Cake 3. Outside of the maintenance burden, a lot of folks were starting to actually use more full JavaScript web frameworks, right? So they weren't using just jQuery or just Prototype or whatever it was to build this interactivity. If folks remember, in 2007, the iPhone came out, and that was pretty neat. Was it 2007, 2006? Something like that. But folks were starting to write more interesting mobile web applications. Odd as the motto was, it was SOLOMO, so social, local, mobile. That was the slogan for web app development. And it had important implications for what it was that we were building. So whenever I write a web application, I don't require a ton of interactivity. Maybe there's a drop down here, maybe I have an AJAX call over here, maybe there's some animation to like fade something in or out. But this kind of builds up over time, and you end up having scripts that kind of fight each other. Maybe you're on the same page and you have a script for that particular action, and then you have a script for the entire page, and they don't interact properly, right? And they're trying to fight over control over a single DOM element that blocks users from buying something on your website, and that's just not a great look for you. And I think the majority of applications don't need a full web framework. So even if you're writing a social, mobile, or local application, you may not have needed to use a framework. But when we were avoiding them, we needed to be pretty careful about building a new framework in JavaScript to display our applications. I think mobile apps like Foursquare or early Twitter were kind of like that. They didn't need a ton of interactivity because we were just kind of fighting stuff like bad phone signal strength or underpowered devices, and not necessarily the fact that like we need to render something complex. But they did need something in the browser. And I think there's like a kind of like an in-between between something like jQuery and the React that we have today. And that was pretty much a death knell for the JsHelper in CakePHP. We needed something in between, but we didn't know what it was that it needed to be. We didn't want to pick the wrong technology for what it was that we wanted to display to our users. And I think developers pretty much everywhere were kind of looking for something better to contain the 1,000-line JavaScript file, script.js files that they had floating in their applications, and maybe something in kind of like a familiar setting or familiar package for their back-end development frameworks. So I think one of the actual first interesting frameworks in this space was jQuery Mobile. It provided a really rich native-looking UI for mobile applications and a better, really overall mobile experience. In fact, one of the first mobile applications I built was actually a ticketing application. We used jQuery Mobile. It's pretty great. It ended up being 30% of our traffic. Pretty awesome. My boss ended up then saying we were always in on mobile. That wasn't the case, but it did prove to us that we could make that possible, viable for our business. And then ended up pushing us to build a real iOS application and a real Android application. There was another early framework that I remember from this time, Backbone.js. Backbone.js was an MVC framework that was very, very similar to CakePHP, to Rails, to any of these other backend frameworks that were available. It was built on top of _JS. So if folks remember jQuery allowed you to kind of iterate over things and select DOM elements and do really whatever you want to do. Underscore was kind of a lighter weight version of jQuery. You could do a lot of the same interactions. It didn't support every single browser, but it supported the more modern stuff that you could do, or more modern browsers. And both of these were pretty grokkable for backend developers, right? So if you're familiar with a backend framework, if you're familiar with an MVC framework, you could pick up Backbone.js and it's pretty straightforward. So if you knew CakePHP, if you knew Rails, if you knew Symfony, you could probably pick up Backbone and build an application in the front end. And in fact, that same ticketing app that I built in jQuery Mobile, we re-architected into a much more performant Backbone.js application. I, of course, built very little of that app because I don't know JavaScript. And it probably wouldn't have been performant if I had done so. So if you want some front-end code, don't hire me. I'm not good at that. There's also a recurring theme here. I mentioned before that a lot of the stuff here is sprouting from backend developers. Ember.js was another framework that came out. It sprouted from the Rails community. If folks are familiar with Ember.js, it came from Sprout Core. That was actually the first version. I think Sprout Core 2.0, and then they created Ember.js. And they both Ember and Backbone kind of really pushed forward Web 2.0. In Ember's case, the killer application was a re-implementation of PowerPoint in the browser, which is pretty cool. This is, again, 2011 when we were still fighting IE5 and didn't know like how to write applications that were like cross-browser friendly. So it's pretty nifty that they could implement an entire desktop application in the browser and have that be super performant. And I think like both of these frameworks really push things forward in a way that's not really appreciated by the JavaScript community today. It's kind of like a candle that blew out really early. So I think to summarize, the front-end community started really rallying behind these frameworks, and CakePHP's JsHelper really didn't put it forward, or didn't have like a place in modern application development. The interactions that abstracted didn't make sense to re-implement from more modern frameworks or web frameworks. So you couldn't really say, hey, like we're going to do drag and drop in a Backbone app because that's specific to your Backbone app. Same with Ember. You couldn't use autocomplete, or we couldn't re-implement autocomplete because that didn't really have a place in these newer frameworks, right? We didn't have like a really good abstraction for those new frameworks. So we couldn't really say, hey, like here's how you build a CakePHP app, here's the JsHelper, and here's the version that works for both, again, Backbone, for Ember.js, for XYZ framework. We didn't know what to build there. The really only good answer would be to write our own front-end framework, and that I think would have been a bad answer for us to have. And so for better or worse, we just removed the JsHelper in 3.0. I do remember there were a lot of people complaining about that. I also do remember that many people did not volunteer to re-implement JsHelper for 3.0, so here we are. So most of this talk has been going over ancient history, and I'm going to skip about 10 years of front-end development. The rise of Node.js, server-side JavaScript, the node modules taking up all of your disk space. We could talk about that forever and not really get into CakePHP, so I'm going to skip all of that. There are some frameworks that I do want to mention out there. Today, we can use Ember.js still. It's kind of evolved a little bit. We can use Vue.js. Folks are familiar with React. Folks are familiar with Next.js. I think in the same way that I chose CakePHP because it was a 5-minute tutorial that made me feel like I had superpowers, the front-end frameworks that you work with that are really good are probably influenced by some blog developer out there or some blog post out there by a developer who decided, hey, this is going to be really performant for me. And then you just like kind of pick that. It's not really decided by anything else, by your framework or anything. So regardless of what framework you pick, you're largely going to have the same issues that you would have with any backend framework, just kind of with a twist. To make it easier to kind of visualize, I'm going to talk about a standard content management system as my example. So when you're building a content management system, you probably have a login page, you have a way to log out, you have some way to manage content, some user management, that sort of thing, pretty standard bare bones stuff. So if you code that logic in your front end, that means you're probably building an API to power a lot of this stuff, and you're rendering responses based on the responses from that API. You're probably going to be writing routing logic in both your front end and your back end application. You're going to be duplicating a lot of validation logic in both your front end and your back end application, so you can skip requests and to make your application more responsive. And you're probably going to be making bespoke APIs with like a single endpoint that can use to like retrieve that response for your browser. What I'm getting at here is that developing your application at this point now happens twice, right? And it needs to, I think, because you want to have a good experience for your users, right? It doesn't make sense to just implement something in the back end and hope that the front end is going to work fine, or rely solely on your front end for validation and then hope no one's going to try to trick your back end into doing the wrong thing. And I think it's difficult and basically impossible in some cases to expose that same logic from your backend into a front-end app. I think there's like new technologies out there today that allow you to embed PHP in the browser, but it's not super performant in some cases, and it's actually pretty difficult to run. But I think what this means is that the extra duplication extends your development time and introduces more places to have bugs or confusing logic, because now you, again, have to implement this stuff twice. And every time I've encountered this, the front-end team eventually starts writing more and more server-side code to reduce some of the code duplication or the bugs that like we might encounter day to day. Is this interesting work? Maybe. If you want to write more node on the server, is this good use of developer time? Also, maybe. Depends on if you want to have a company that like is still open tomorrow. Like they could be writing product code as opposed to duplicating your backend logic. Did your CMS also need to be built in React? If it's internal, probably not. If it's public, maybe. I don't know. There's really kind of like no good answer here. I think it's important to really think about the business case, business context, what it is that we're building. In some cases, we actually do 100% need a reactive front-end framework, right? I mentioned working on a ticketing application. And we had a page where we would render stadium charts, right? So you can see where you're sitting in the stadium, and it's pretty great, or the venue, whatever. Imagine if every single time you panned or zoomed or you click on a section and you had a full page refresh in order to see the content. I don't think anyone would ever come back to that web page. My boss would probably have a good long talk with me as to why I thought that was a good idea, and I probably would need to find a new job relatively quickly. we wouldn't make payroll, no one would use our website, we wouldn't sell tickets, etc. I think there's also applications where the front-end framework overcomplicates work. So a content management system is one of those examples where you don't really need a front-end framework. An admin tool that kind of manages an application release doesn't need a GraphQL backend API and a React front-end for like doing that, right? That could just be like a general backend framework, a full-stack backend framework. As you develop applications in the future, I really challenge you to think, do we need this extra technology? Can we just write this all in Cake? Or can we write this all in our backend framework? Is it really necessary for our goal, or is it just something that you're introducing because you write a blog post about this new hot technology and want to implement that? So let's say we don't want or need a front-end framework. Does CakePHP provide enough today in order for us to allow for a bit of interactivity in our application for our content management system? I'd say out of the box, probably no, because we don't have any front-end code for that. The browser still has a gap that it's missing in terms of what it needs in order to provide that reactive type of experience. And especially with the removal of JsHelper and the JsHelper, we can't do that today. That's not to say you can't build these kind of applications if you need that interactivity. I just had 2 demos where I did that. You can make a simple AJAX request in your application from your form, render some response, and that would be totally fine. You can disable the layout, render a different view, etc. You don't need another library for that. You can just do that with jQuery or something like that. Similarly, we can render like elements from an autocomplete form and just render that into the browser. No extra code needed, really. But doing so, I think, gets back into the weird pattern where we have this gigantic script.js file that's 1,000 lines of code that we're now replicating logic in both JavaScript and PHP because we need to build these applications. We've written half a framework, half a JavaScript framework, and that's not super great. And then we have code that like really doesn't make sense to half our developers, right? The folks that don't understand JavaScript aren't going to be able to contribute to that, and they're just going to leave it alone. I think like we can and should do better for both our frameworks, for our developers, for our customers. Right? So we want to stick with CakePHP, but we also want to build interactivity into our applications. We still do need something like jQuery. We still do need something like Scriptaculous or MooTools or whatever, and use that on top of our framework. But the framework the library or the framework that we choose doesn't actually have to require us to use JavaScript, to write JavaScript to build this interactivity. So I'm going to get to the meat and potatoes of my talk, or at least the end of it. Again, with HtmX, we can lightly decorate our existing CakePHP views to progressively enhance and build interactivity into the application where it matters, right? The demos I've shown in this talk so far have been written with minimal changes to a CakePHP application. If you built any other CakePHP app, you can build a CakePHP app with HtmX. It's all just generic HTML with a couple of extra HTML attributes. Other frameworks have had some method to do this, or some method similar to HtMX in varying degrees. If you're familiar with Rails, Rails initially provided this via turbolinks, which is kind of the same thing as our JsHelper. And today they have turboframes that have Hotwire, Strata, Stimulus, etc. Laravel uses Hotwire, and they have, well, something they call Hotwire, and they have Inertia. Does CakePHP need an official integration with some library or framework? I think it might help adoption. Folks might use it and have better applications in general, but I don't know that we need to promulgate something directly within the core. Of course, it doesn't stop you from building like a more like interactive application. You can pick an existing library or framework and build these types of things. We're kind of unopinionated about front-end development because there are lots of ways to do the same thing. But if you're looking for something lightweight, I think HtMX might be the way. So we're going to do our last demo. So a common use case in a application is to have some long-running process that you run in the background, and you do this because you want to, maybe keep the user up to date on the status of that process, right? You don't want to do this as part of a web request because then you're beholden to that browser being open for that action to finish, or for your backend to not time out during that request. Common use case for this is to run it in a queue, and you can use the CakePHP queue app plugin for this work. The work gets processed on some message bus, and then the status might get displayed back to a user in some fashion. For this demo, we're not going to be using the queue plugin, but you can do that. I'm going to be building a polling application in CakePHP for the status of some particular process, right? We're actually going to be polling via HtMx, so that's pretty cool. And then showing that result in the UI. We're going to be building this polling site. I'm going to be building the polling site that I showed off for the raffle. So if you remember my raffle demo, this is all the code that I needed for that. To start, we're going to create our raffle controller with bake. It's going to be more or less empty, so I'm going to specify no actions. Next, we're going to add a very simple index action to the controller. For the demo, we're going to specify the old default layout because I just want to use the old layout. It's fine, whatever. But otherwise, the action's not going to really do anything. The view is pretty straightforward. This form allows us to pick a minimum and maximum number to randomly choose from, right? It gets submitted via a post request that we specify at the top via hxpost. So pretty similar to any other post or any other form, except we're going to use hxpost instead of URL. The response is going to be written to the winner, the div with the winner word class on it. HtmX provides a couple different ways to swap the contents of the response with the target. We previously specified before end, so before we completed the pagination, added again, but then the default case is inner HTML, which means replace the entire content. You don't need to specify inner HTML, I just have it for completeness here. Other than not having a URL, the form is more or less the same as any other form created by the form helper, right? So when we go, well, I'm going to show this again, we're going to hit start picker for this request. So the start picker action is pretty straightforward. It's essentially going to respond with some HTML and that we need and nothing really else. I'm going to disable the layout. I could have, again, disabled it in our controller everywhere when I detect an HtmX request. In this particular case, all requests of this are going to be disabled, so whatever. One other thing I'm going to do is set the min and max for the template. Cool. So in a template, we're going to use long polling as a mechanism for checking the raffle winner. If anyone's built an application, you've probably built at some point or another a long polling mechanism that's just going to every couple seconds retrieve a request from the response or from the server. Alternatives that HtMX does support are server-sent events and WebSockets via extension to that library. We can build that into a CakePHP application. It's just not trivial to do, and for the demo, I didn't really want to spend too much time on it. But for now, we're just going to use long polling. So our template file spits out a div that is triggers a GET request to our choose winner action. We add a couple extra query string arguments via hxvals. Again, there are a ton of extra attributes that you can use in HtMX. In this particular case, you can use hxvals to add more query string parameters. You can also add that to the hxget where we're building a URL. The reason I'm displaying this here is because I'm showing off that you can have extra values that are like not related to a URL. So for instance, instead of having rendered array there, we can have JavaScript that dynamically retrieves attributes from your web page on load. The trigger in this case happens every 2 seconds. There are a ton of different triggers in HtMX. This is the third different kind of trigger that I've shown in this demo, and they cover a wide variety of use cases for your applications. If you have something that isn't covered, again, you can fall back to JavaScript to trigger your events if you want to. Finally, we're going to put together our choose winner action, right? So in this particular case, we're going to set the min and max as view variables. We're also going to randomly decide whether we're going to pick a winner, right? So 50% of the time, we don't pick up a winner. HtMX long polling can be stopped server side by specifying a specific header on the response. So in this particular case, I'm taking advantage of the HtMX component's stop polling method to stop the long polling. The template here is also pretty simple. If there's a winner, we display it. Otherwise, we tell folks that we're still polling. So pretty straightforward, nothing really fancy here. You didn't really need to know anything about JavaScript in order to have this. So I'm going to go back and show off the last demo. So we're at our last demo here. And we're going to display that here. Refresh that page. So you'll see here that I'm going to select a winner. It's going to poll. So that first start picker had the initial, we're going to start polling. And then every 2 seconds, maybe, hopefully. Maybe my browser is broken. Start that again. All right, I needed to pick a min and max. Cool. So we'll do that. Right. Awesome. Great. Attendee 21. That's the last winner of CakeFest. We're going to start again. Come on. 16. Oh, 16, we have a winner.
Oh, yay.
I hope you have luggage space. So pretty straightforward application. We are using long polling here. Again, you can use WebSockets if you wanted to implement a WebSocket server. You can use Server Center events as well. Nothing really fancy here, etc. So one thing I really want to emphasize here, that was raffle time, the HtMx raffle. One thing I want to emphasize here today is that providing interactivity in your application no longer needs a whole new framework, right? In many cases, you might not even need to write any JavaScript at all. And for better or worse, we don't need to revive the JsHelper. I think with HtMx, we can provide very delightful experiences for our users. And so I'd like to thank everyone who has worked on the JavaScript frameworks over the years and libraries to make that possible. So that's the end of my talk. Thanks.